everyone. This is Ronnie from Everything Vive, and I have a kind of a different guest with me today. He's a friend of mine. His name's Abdul Suleiman. He's the Chief Experience Officer of UX for 4SIGHT, a UX agency that's rated among the top UX agencies in the US by UpCity. And I wanted to bring him on the show specifically because I thought I was talking with him about the work that he does, and I thought it would be particularly relevant to a lot of our listeners out there that are in game development. For those of you that don't know, UX stands for it's shorthand for user experience. And Abdul is definitely, a thought leader in this area. He served as a user experience subject matter expert and completed projects for over 40 Fortune 500 companies, including Disney, Citi, SeaWorld, as well as the Navy. So he definitely has a lot of experience here. He's taught as an adjunct professor at DePaul University here in Chicago at their graduate UX program for over 5 years, and a total of 9 different UX subjects. He's also recognized as a subject matter expert in making websites and software applications easier to use and more profitable. And that's one of the major reasons I wanted to bring him on the show, because obviously we here at Everything Vive usually focus on the gaming aspects of VR, and user experience definitely has a big role to play in making sure that people are immersed in game experiences. But there are so many more applications for VR as well that would benefit from having a good understanding of user experience and different interfacing. So thank you so much for joining me, Abdul. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Thanks for having me, Ronnie.
Yeah, so I guess to start off, and I'm fairly new to this world. I definitely see the parallels in terms of software applications in VR and where it could help. But first, could you explain to the listeners how you got into this field of work to begin with?
Sure. So I was actually originally going to go to law school, Ronnie.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So what happened was I finished my law school applications. I gathered my recommendations, put them all in an envelope, and I just needed to simply drop them in the mailbox. And I stopped and thought about it and asked myself if that was really the path I wanted to take. And I thought, not actually, no, law school is not my calling. I have a high degree of respect for lawyers. Hey, my wife's a lawyer, married to one, right? So,
Yep.
yeah, but it wasn't for me. So what happened was I did a little bit of research. I stumbled across a master's program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I wasn't familiar with the degree itself, but looking at the curriculum, it really resonated with me. And this, in the academic setting, was called HCI. That's human-computer interaction. And that's what they call UX in the academic world. And it's all about understanding users through user research and designing according to this understanding. And so after graduation, I furthered my experience through various senior user experience work engagements, acquiring different certifications, and at one point, at a later point, teaching at the graduate school level.
Okay, well, very interesting. What in particular kind of led you to decide that this was interesting? Like, because obviously there was something about it, especially considering you had thought about doing law and got kind of pulled over. Like, what was it about user experience design that captivated you?
Yeah, great question, Ronnie. So I was thinking about it. Like, I don't like reading fine print. That was a big thing for me. So I was like,
That's fair.
It's just not my thing, right? But what was my thing? I really enjoyed making sure that whatever experience someone would be interacting with, that they felt that was very fulfilling, that they felt very immersed in that experience, and it felt very close and intimate, and that it resonated with them in that way. And that's the type of vibe I was getting when I was looking over those courses. And as I was practicing, I developed a deeper appreciation for that interaction. And so understanding people at a very deep level, understanding the way they think, what we call mental models, understanding how that there are limitations that people have, memory limitations, physical limitations, and their physiological limitations, and making sure that we're designing according to their mental and physical states in a way that works best for them. And so I found that very, very satisfying. And then even when we talk about virtual reality, we're talking about an immersive experience, right? So
Mhm.
how do we immerse them in that state and not disrupt it due to a kink that we didn't anticipate, right? If we know that user so well, if we know them like the back of our hand, then we know exactly how we should take them in the progressive states into that software environment, into that immersive VR experience. And then how do we keep them engaged? And how do we take them in that user journey all the way to the end and want them coming back and talking about that game and wanting to use it more? That's
So
what I loved about UX.
Huh. So I think you already answered this, but I mean, for users out there that might not be as used to hearing the term, I mean, how would you define user experience design?
Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky question, Ronnie, because there isn't no single accepted definition of what UX is. Although there is an ISO definition from the International Organization of Standards, that's a global standard of thinking about what they call user-centered design or human-centered design in some circles. But UX is very similar to that. And at UX Foresight here, we define it as the art and science of designing products that are easy to use to meet user expectations and business goals. So what that means is uh, this is this is an appreciation for how design looks aesthetically to users in a subjective way, but also in a more in a way that's more grounded in science, in a more empirical way, where we have case studies and other types of experiments that show how users parse data as they look at it, how they scan paragraphs in their eyes when they're reading, making sure that we're breaking up content in a very digestible way, making sure that we have contrast ratios that are perfectly fit for users. And if users have a little bit more difficulty seeing because of their age or other types of visual impairments, that we have the right types of colors to use in combination for that purpose. So all that goes into the art and science of designing that better product that makes it easier to use. And we're meeting those user expectations. At the same time, it's more profitable for businesses. So think about this, right? So you have a software company and you are creating this VR application that you're rolling out to hundreds and thousands of users, for example. And we're in the business of not just helping users to enjoy our products, but we want to stay in business. That's a good part of staying in a business goal, right? So definitely want to stay in business. And if the users don't like what we created for them, then we're not going to stay in business very long. If it doesn't work for them, then it's
Hmm.
not going to work for
No,
us.
and I would
Yeah.
say that that's even a bigger concern in the VR space than a
Uh,
lot of other more traditional software businesses, because really, I mean, especially considering that there are so many new users in VR, if there's if someone tries virtual reality for the first time, or even is a even if they're a more seasoned user, if they have bad experiences, that tends to kind of take them away from the platforms altogether. So rather than just saying, "Oh, I don't like this piece of software," sometimes a bad virtual reality experience can lead someone to not using the headset further. So that's definitely something I think that a lot of listeners out there will will ring true to them anyways, as far as like making sure that users aren't sick when they're experiencing titles, but also like you were saying, just making sure that I think there's a lot of frontier and kind of new arenas to research in virtual reality when it comes to user experience design, because there's just so much that isn't that's new and that has different approaches. I mean, some of the examples you mentioned were different contrast ratios for reading certain types of fonts and design choices like that. I mean, in virtual reality, if if certain fonts or text aren't displayed appropriately, it's not even unsettling. You simply can't read some of that stuff if it's not presented properly. So I mean, I think user experience design is at the forefront of what's important in VR right now, and I think a lot of this stuff is not is not fully understood, and so sometimes when certain developers or companies get it right, the software itself is just that much more impressive, and you don't really always know, well, what is it about this title that stands out from everything else? And it's like a lot of these small things that add up to making the experience just overall such a smoother and more comfortable one for the users.
Absolutely. I totally agree with everything you just said, Ronnie. And this whole idea of making sure that your product, when it goes to market, is the right product is at the forefront, like you said. And it used to not be that way, where before technology makers, like even, for example, cell phone makers, smartphone makers, what they would manufacturers, what they would do is they would just create it, throw it out in the market, and see if it sticks. But we've got to the point where that's too expensive. It's too expensive because, like what you were saying, those new users, those first impressions are so critical because you might lose them for good. They might get motion sickness. They might get eye strain in that VR environment and not feel like they ever want to go back to it again.
And especially for a lot of indie developers out there, I mean, if you're releasing like a virtual reality game on the Steam platform, for example, I mean, kudos to Steam, to Valve and Steam. They have a great and easy return policy. But unfortunately for developers out there, I mean, if your user has a bad first impression of a game, they're going to get a refund on that game, and you're not going to be getting those sales. So that's definitely something that, I mean, this is super, super, super important for especially new developers that are trying to, get value out of the games that they're releasing.
Absolutely.
Getting to VR more specifically and user experience design there, what are some easy tips or best practices to make sure that people are implementing in UX for better VR?
Great question. So I think I would approach this in two ways. I would talk about it in terms of design and research. So this will sound a little bit theoretical, but I want to relate this to VR in a way that's a little bit different angle here that we could appreciate. So design and research. The first in design, I want to talk about skeuomorphism. And skeuomorphism is where we have a design look more like reality. We see it all around us. Like if you have buttons looking more 3D in our interface, then that's more like a real life metaphor. Same thing with digital trash bins that you see sometimes in different software environments, right? That is taking the real world, putting it into the virtual world in an exact way or very close to it. That's called skeuomorphism.
Okay.
Now, I want to contrast that with flat design. Flat design is a more minimalist response to skeuomorphism. So flat design we'll see more like in iOS products and that type of taking away of that real world aspect from that UI, right? From the controls, from the buttons and all those. So it looks less like the real world. And so why is it that we're going in that direction? Why are software makers and other UI developers moving in that direction of flat design? I would say that Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said it best when he said, and this is a very famous quote of his, it seems that perfection is attained not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away. Okay? So now going to VR is about as anti-flat design as it gets, right? Because it's a totally immersive experience where you're seeing the reality in this virtual reality, right? You're seeing it in a completely different environment. Why? Because it seems to replace your reality with this virtual reality. So VR is actually very skeuomorphic to the ultimate level.
And actually, just not to interrupt you, but there's like a lot of examples of games that will literally, like you were talking about, if there are certain types of options, like a traditional options menu, for example, rather than having them just simply be menus. There's some titles where it will be like a door that you have to physically open to get
There
to
we go.
something, or like you were saying, if you want to get rid of something, you actually literally have to throw it in a trash bin, or something
Yeah.
like that. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because in some ways, some of what's being done in VR is kind of, it seems like it's kind of going down a different trend than, like, it is more skeuomorphism than, what was the second one that you mentioned, the more.
Flat design.
Yeah,
Flat
it's
design.
it then,
Yeah.
I'm sure there are examples of more, flat design kind of UI UXs
Uh-huh.
in games, but yeah, in virtual reality, you see, I think some of the more impressive stuff is where developers find clever ways of kind of hide, because part of the thing that's different about virtual reality, I'd say, than using a lot of other interfaces, is that at least right now in this infant form of virtual reality, just the act of interacting with things in and of itself is kind of a pleasurable experience. So like like just interacting with the door to get to the menu, it's clever, but it's also like, oh, that was fun. Like, it feels like I'm interacting with something,
Yeah.
so it is kind of interesting to think about some of the, like, in virtual reality, how not only does the functionality of the interface matter, but also sometimes how the actual interaction that you use to access those functions in and of themselves can be part of the experience.
That makes sense. So like micro interactions and other things along the way, they all contribute to that overall experience.
The
Yeah.
sense of place, like you're in this environment, because obviously in the real world you wouldn't be interacting with menus, but here it's kind of you know, a mix between a computer world and the real world. And
Yeah. So what you're touching on is exactly the point I was looking to hit here, and that is, um, maybe we're going too skeuomorphic sometimes in VR in a way that makes it overly complicated for the user. If we're trying to do everything too literally, then sometimes it makes it actually more difficult. And I'll give you an example. So there's a client that was asking that we review their e-commerce site, right? And he could not figure out why his sales were so poor on this new site. And so I took a look through it, and um, I needed to add a product to the shopping cart. And I asked him, I was like, dude, I cannot figure out how you add an item to your shopping cart here. He said, well, it's very obvious. I said, like, what? Like, how would you do it in the real world? He asked. I said, well, I'd take an item, I'd put it in the shopping cart. He said, that's what you do here. He literally had drag and drop functionality as the
mm,
only way to put an item in the shopping cart. So it was too literal in that
mm.
way. And so, to your point, menus and other things that where maybe we don't need to go completely VR in those ways could make it easier in some ways to better conceptualize what's happening in that VR environment.
The example that you rose kind of reminds me of a scenario I had, which, like, and I'm probably in a unique position where I'm often, meeting with developers, and they're kind of help like they're giving me some feedback or some, kind of tips on how to get through some of their software. I remember playing a title for the first time and having a ton of fun with it, and there was a particular moment in the game where I tried to I couldn't figure out what it was the game wanted of me. Like, I just didn't know exactly what I was being asked to do. And, like, in this scenario, the developer was there to kind of remind me, hey, it's VR. Like, what are your options? Like, think about, like, what you're supposed to be doing. And kind of similar to your situation, where when someone tells you, well, what would you do in the real world? And then all
Yeah.
of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, drag and drop. And then once you know that that's the method that you're supposed to be using, then it's easy, then it makes sense, and all of that. And on one hand, in that scenario, I felt like, oh, I was so stupid. Why didn't I think of doing that? On the
Mm.
other hand, though, like, there's in that particular instance, that developer was able to tell me what to do. But
Yeah,
for so many users out there, there's going to be, when confronted with those same situations, they're not going to have someone telling them what to do.
yeah,
And and I guess I mean that leads me to think that as a developer that you really need to be thinking about like if there are any hitches. I mean, it's probably really challenging to find new players to try out your experiences over and over again. But it seems like that would be crucial to really understanding, whether your design is actually effective or not.
absolutely.
Because as soon as someone knows what they're supposed to be doing, they're no longer, I think, like a very like honest probably
Uh-huh.
gauge of what you're designing, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Ronnie. I love this conversation, by the way. We're really hitting a lot of super important points in UX and VR. So one of those is the idea of recall versus recognition. And this is a heuristic. That means it's a UX best practice that was established by Jacob Nielsen, the Nielsen Norman Group, and that principle, that heuristic of recall versus recognition, says that, well, when I look at this UI or this interface, do I have to recall how it works? Like, do I need to have that buddy or the developer next to me or someone else to say, or call center even, to tell me how this works? And it's going to be very costly if you're going to call support to make this work, if you even bother to call support or just
Mm-hmm.
abandon the application altogether.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. They're not going to have that there, or they maybe not take the extra step to learn of how to use that interaction, versus recognition, where recognition, you see it, it's so intuitive the way it's designed that the interface speaks out to you and says, this is how I ought to be worked with. And that's a principle of what's called visual affordance. Visual affordance says, does this control tell me how it ought to be interacted with? Does it communicate that to me? And that's what we're hitting, that's what we're getting at with this more intuitive approach. And then to your other point about new users, so those are oftentimes some of the most telling, the new users, because they don't have an existing mental model or an existing understanding of how this works, right? They're coming into it fresh.
Mm-hmm.
So when we do our user research, we will almost always want to recruit new users, but we also want to include a mix of existing users. And each of those might have a very different experience with that interaction. And we might even present certain tasks in our research to the new users that we won't present to the existing. So for example, you might have a website and you have people logging in. Those are existing users, right? So we'll be testing certain logged in or authenticated state types of tasks. But for those that are outside the website, new users, that might be something that more limited to persuasive aspects of getting them even to sign up with the site, right? So those are some other tasks there. So different perspectives coming from those different backgrounds.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess like what are some other do you have any other kind of best practices that you wanted to share?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
because I know that those are going to be particularly useful to people out there that might not, for especially people that are new. I think a decent amount of game developers kind of have at least an understanding that they need to be concerned about these types of issues. But some people out there are just trying to, come up with something fun in a game and they're not aware of some of these things. So like, yeah, the more that you can kind of throw out there
Yeah.
to give people kind of a leg up, the better.
For sure. Let me hit some of those points too. So we talked a little about the VR and skeuomorphism, and I was just kind of set the foundation of some of these different tips we could look into more. And so that skeuomorphic approach to design might put us in danger of going too far into our design and development before we sufficiently vetted it. Right. So the idea is that this might cost us heavily in redesign and redevelopment. So now, like conventional agile design methodology, something that a lot of developers are more familiar with or have been exposed to it some way, that methodology says that we want to fail fast and fail often. Okay. And this means that we get as many of the kinks out early so it doesn't cost us as much downstream.
Mm-hmm.
And we could change it very quickly later if we need to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the idea. It's a very progressive type of approach to
Mm-hmm.
development.
Mm-hmm.
And one way we could do that is by beginning our VR experiences with designing in a very low fidelity level, like a paper sketch or prototype, and then go on to a 2D type of approach with Sketch. Sketch is an application, it's a design tool it's very popular to use. It's an alternative to Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, so we can use Sketch. So either one is fine, but it's a 2D approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can move on in our VR design to something like Unity, which is great for our VR types of experiences that we're designing. And then we could view our VR experience and test that further with users with Oculus or Cardboard or any of these other types of viewers. And you should test throughout the different phases too. So all these different phases that we mentioned, test throughout. Make sure we're aligned with who that user is, that beginner user, that existing user, or whatever, older user, younger. There's so many different personas we could create and ensure that we're really targeting who we want to use this application and use it well.
Mm-hmm. That actually, like, mentioning this kind of, I know some teams out there, especially ones that are more experienced, probably, like, reach out to testers and all of that prior to any sort of public release. But I know that they're like something that is especially popular with like indie teams and like smaller, newer developers. I mean, and bigger developers for that matter. But so at some point, when with a lot of particularly like more indie titles, but whatever. At some point, there Steam, for example, it's one of the major PC platforms for software games, and they obviously let developers publish for VR titles as well. They have a program called Early Access, which is basically a way for developers to sell the product at a relatively early age. So at an early stage in the development cycle, but one late enough where you're actually selling them like a working title that has some functionality and like, it is a game, even though it might not be finished. Developers are able to sell that, label it as early access, and then set like a future date at which they're going to officially release the game. So essentially, people that are purchasing the product at an early access stage are getting to try out the software before it's finished, and then kind of provide input or experience, basically provide additional data that the developers can use to hopefully make it better. And the reason I'm mentioning this in conjunction with what you're talking about is not only that, like, in some ways it'll be useful to get that feedback and to get users to try your game out at the early. But I was just wondering what your thoughts were in terms of like what maybe some of the pitfalls might be on letting users try out your software in a state that perhaps isn't as much polished. Like what do you think the upsides and downsides of a process like that might be for the developers?
Yeah, great question. So it's good that they're reaching out to get this feedback at the early access stage there. Now, the problem, so this is kind of a beta type of version that they're releasing to these users to get some input. So the issue that may come about is, how do we vet this type of feedback? How do we know exactly the type of feedback we need to get? And what if they're just opinions? What if they're just like people saying, I like this, I don't like that. And the problem with that is maybe it's not really what they don't like or like. And if we're just taking what users say and just implementing it as is, then we're not doing our job properly to ensure that we're getting the best design possible, because that's not how user research works. It works in a way that we have a more controlled environment where we know what type of data we're getting and we understand it very well, because there's a lot of variables when you're taking opinions from people in this way. there's a lot of subjectivity that can come about, and there's inaccuracies
I'm
and
super glad
misinterpretations that can
yeah.
happen because we don't understand really what they mean. I'll give you an example. So Walmart, what they did was they released a survey to their consumer base, and their marketing team found that Walmart shoppers, according to the survey anyway, say that they want a less cluttered storefront. Okay. So these marketing gurus at Walmart said, okay, let's just redesign all the stores and make them less cluttered and more organized. And what's the harm with that? And one of those guys, he actually was an ex executive from Target, where that's exactly the strategy that they had, right? And he was projecting his interpretation onto what he saw in that survey, and just redesign these stores in that way. Well, and they're just waiting for the sales to just go through the roof, and it went the other way. They lost $1.85 billion.
Wow.
Okay, and they could not figure out what happened, so they did some post interviews and tried to understand from shoppers what was happening. And the conclusion they drew after talking with them and clarifying really what they meant was that, well, in the past experience at Walmart, it just felt like they were getting a better deal. Their perception of that experience was that the products were actually less expensive and they were getting better value and a better deal. And now it just doesn't feel that way.
Huh.
But the prices weren't changed at all. It was completely perception. So my point is this, guys, that we have this game, it's out there, and these users say, well, this and that. And if we were to just take what they're saying and redesign around that without understanding really what they mean or what is really necessary for them to have a better experience, then we might end up in the same shoes as Walmart and have that type of loss.
See, I was going to say I'm really glad I brought that question up because I hear all the time, and I'm not a developer myself. Perhaps other developers out there can speak up and the various comments or whatnot, or email us. But yeah, like I hear all the time that feedback is being taken into account, or like a lot of times developers in general are looking for feedback directly from users, and early access is one of those ways. But in general, I do think that like direct customer feedback is a major way, at least right now, that a lot of smaller studios are able to kind of make some of these decisions. And I think the point you raise is a very, very good one, in that a lot of users aren't necessarily like even I would say even complex, like sophisticated users, you can't even necessarily trust their feedback always,
Yeah.
because perhaps the more sophisticated are, the more they believe they understand what's affecting their experience, when in fact it's all of these intangibles that they don't fully understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're absolutely right. So even like when we're doing testing, we want to sometimes, especially with those more experienced users that are experts or even they're very close to the product, we won't want to focus on them as much because they have a very different level of understanding from who our real target is.
Hmm.
And so like that could throw us off. Like those early stage people, we're trying to acquire more of a bigger user base than we're targeting people who are beginners, right, or just
Yeah.
getting into this. So you'll exclude those because you're not taking into consideration their needs and what they're experiencing. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to hate on early access. I think it's a great way of
Yeah.
getting people more involved and getting more feedback directly from the users, which is good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always good to get some direct feedback, but I would say keep the direct feedback coming in, but have a gatekeeper there with the right methods who understands user research to vet it and repurpose it and implement it as the right design solution for
Yeah.
your PR product.
If I'm hearing you correctly, it also sounds like perhaps like let's say, for just like a theoretical example, you receive negative feedback on a certain product, and you see a recurring theme time and time again. That recurring theme might definitely or probably does point to something that needs to be addressed, but it might not necessarily be
Yeah.
the thing that people are actually expressing. That's the
Right.
problem.
You're absolutely right, Ronnie. And so sometimes even clients that come to us and we're in a scoping call where we're beginning a project and they say, here's the problem, blah, blah, blah. Here's what we want to change on the site. And we take that in and just like the user, we say, is that really the problem here? Or is that a symptom of the problem that we need to address?
Hmm.
And that's where we take a step further to validate that, to verify really what is causing that. Because you can't solve anything until you understand the root problem. We need to define the problem and solve it.
So along that line, if developers out there are trying to look into new methods of getting good data for their upcoming projects, or if they're interested in learning more so that they can do it on their own for future titles, like what are the best ways for developers out there to learn more about UX, but also get the expertise that they perhaps need to better their products?
Sure, sure. So one good way of doing that is there are easy ways of just getting out there and getting some more feedback and learning more about this. You could look into, let's see, what would be the best way to do it. So I would say like a really good book to read if you want to get a quick read on something.
Mm.
And that's a book by Steve Krug, and it's one of my favorites. It's Don't Make Me Think, and it's a really good book to better understand UX. And he just takes you through it. And as you're flipping through the pages of this book, you literally feel like you're not thinking about it. Like even like what you said, Ronnie, like when you have someone in that VR environment and not having to think about it very much, just to really engage and perform in an intuitive, just in a way that feels natural to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how that book is, like when you're reading it and the concept that he's talking about. So Steve Krug, Krug, is a great way to learn more about UX. Okay, if you want to read up on that. And so the idea is don't make me think, then it's just very second nature when you're going through this experience that's designed for them. Another good way to get more of a deeper understanding in UX is to join different meetups for UX and even associations like the UXPA is a popular association to join, and attending their events could also help you understand UX better. One other way to go about it is to get degrees in schools, but that's pretty costly and time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And also getting work experience is great, but it's likely to be difficult to begin that experience without any UX credentials to show for it. So that could be another roadblock there.
How might your user experience design education like help developers improve the VR experience that they're creating? Like as far as like, I mean, what are some of the things in particular that you think an education in this field would help with?
Yeah, it would be very helpful to have a UX design education, and there's different ways to go about that. So all these things that we talked about already, like ensuring that we understand the users and we take the right approach to understanding them, to designing for them, to validating, using different types of prototyping tools, make sure that we're not biasing our data so we don't end up like Walmart, all that stuff. And getting yourself a more a better performing product, and one that's more saleable, that has better, it's more sellable and is more appealing to your user base. Those are the types of benefits you'll get out of a UX design education if you were to apply that. So it really, in general, it helps. This UX design education would help developers become more strategic in their approach to developing for VR. And we do offer our own certification in UX for people. And this curriculum was carefully made to distill the most important aspects of UX that I've learned across 14 years in the field.
And that's through UX 4SIGHT, the company, or is that the? Okay,
yep.
I just wanted to make sure I understood.
Yeah, yep. It's with UX 4SIGHT, our agency, and we really just distilled all this this experience in working with our experience and with the world's top brands, and all that into 5 days. And so we know your time is precious. and no need to go into too much theory about everything that is out there.
Mm-hmm.
But we just thought, what are the most practical things that you should learn these 5 days to help you design a better product and validate it? And so these are live, online, super practical, instructor-led classes that you could finish in only 5 days. So you can ask questions, collaborate with others during hands-on exercises, and these classes are really awesome. And we've had a number of people just really love them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's 3 classes. There's a intro to UX class, a user-centered web and application design class, and the final one is the web and application research class to validate basically what you design. So you're doing the strategy work, understanding what's going on, the field there, and then you're designing around that, and you're validating it. So that's kind of a conceptual way of thinking how that all comes together.
And for your courses, like, are they particularly geared towards creating certain types of experiences, or are they more general to where they could apply to creating a game or creating a software application or creating,
Yeah.
something in VR?
Yeah. So we do touch on a lot of different types of experiences, but it's more general in that way, where you could apply it to VR, or you could apply it to gaming, and you could use it in many different ways. These are very universal principles that you could apply to any product, really. Especially digital. Our focus really is on digital, so that's why it's called web and application design, web and application research. So it's a digital focus for UX, and that of course includes VR and games.
At what point, like, would you recommend someone look into taking a more formal course like yours versus just like reading up on the topic or doing like more informal studies? I'm just kind of curious.
So I think they complement each other. I think that there's people who want to get some kind of base understanding of whether they really want to go this route and learn more and further develop their careers in UX. And that one way to do that is to read that book and read on other books, and even follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is UX4SIGHT, and that's U, then X as an X-ray, the number 4, and S as in Sam, IGHT. And that is a place where you could get various articles that we publish for free, and you could learn more about the field. And if you feel comfortable at that point, then you just register for a course, and or if you're comfortable already and feel like you want to learn about this and improve your product that way, you could jump into the course that way.
Yeah.
We do have a special discount for our courses and certification that's available to the listeners of Everything's Vibe. And so just wanted to make sure that you guys know about that. You'd actually save 50%, and that's $1,245, which is a lot to save when you take our 3-course bundle. And so you get free certification, shipping of your course materials, all at 50% off.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we have instructors that are the same instructors that taught for Disney, Chase, Navy. And to register, you just go to ux4sight.com. Go to our training solutions page. You look for our 3-course bundle to take advantage of our 50% off.
That's awesome. Yeah. Abdul didn't talk to me about this ahead of time, so that's why I'm like, thank you for offering that to our listeners. I really appreciate that.
Sure, no problem.
And to be clear, I mean, I knew about your course ahead of time. It's online, right? So people can, like you were saying, like they'll ship. You basically ship out all of the course materials, and then people. Is it structured as far as like when you're taking the courses, or are they accessible at any time?
Yeah, so the ones that you'll see online on the training page, they're going to have dates attached to them.
Okay.
So it'll say that this next online course will happen on this date and that date. But we also have some special courses that we could specially scheduled courses that we could roll out depending on your needs. Like, let's say you have a group all ready to go and you want to teach them. We could do that as a separate online type of teaching environment. We can also do on-site. So there's different ways to slice and dice this. Okay,
awesome. Yeah. Well, that's super useful information, and I'm so happy to have you on our show. Like I said, just talking to you about UX and what you do made me realize that this is just such a great fit for a lot of our listeners, and particularly like you were saying. I mean, I think whether people are out there kind of already trying to take user experience into account or not, I think it's always valuable to look more into other scientific and other approaches just generally to make sure that you're approaching problems in the best way possible. And especially considering how VR is so new, I think there is such a big opportunity to kind of find new and exciting ways of making user experiences more effective and accessible for users. So it's not always as simple as going on Reddit or Discord and listening to customer feedback. Sometimes you do have to kind of know a little bit more about what's really going on with your titles to really make it that much better. So
Absolutely.
So thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with me. And just one more time, I know you said Twitter, and what are the best ways for people to keep up with you and your company?
Yeah, so Twitter's a great way to go. So UX4SIGHT is our Twitter handle. That's U, X as in X-ray, number 4. S as in Sam, IGHT. That's our Twitter handle. Also visit us on our website, ux4sight.com. Training page, that's under solutions, and look for a 3-course bundle to take advantage of the 50% off for the Everything Vibes.
And is there any kind of deadline as far as like how long do you think that the 50% off will be, or just?
Yeah, so we're thinking that it would be like the next week or so, and so hopefully we will get enough people there, and we'll have a good audience there. But we may end it earlier if we have limited spacing, and so depending on the availability and the seats available. So
and just so that'll be about a week after this episode is posted.
Yep. So yep.
Okay, so like late October-ish is kind of what you're thinking, like second week of October maybe?
Yeah, for registration, but then the classes would be after that at some point. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure that people knew. So.
Yep.
All right, well, thanks again, and we'll be in touch, and thank you everyone out there for listening.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, guys.